Hello everyone and welcome to the official launch of my YouTube channel, where today we're going to be talking all things F1 2024 car launches, liveries, all that fun stuff. I'm currently recording this on my podcasting platform, which I'm also going to release as a podcast, as well as a YouTube video. So if the quality is not very good, I'm very sorry about that. I will deal with that in the coming weeks, but I just wanted to get this video out and all this information out there for you. This is just for us to basically look through the liveries, look through the car designs, see what we've got in front of us, and make some general predictions and general judgments as to what the aims of these cars are. I'm not an aerodynamicist, I'm not an engineer by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just trying my best to point out and explain some bits of the car that you may not have seen, you may not understand, yada yada yada. But I'm not an expert, I don't claim to be. With that in mind, let's get straight into it. We're going to look at each car through an aesthetic/visual lens and also through a technical lens, so we can kind of put the two together and basically see what we've got going forward. Starting with the Haas, the VF24. There's the stark difference when we're looking between the VF23 of last year and the VF24 of this year. So starting aesthetically, now we can see that the new car is a much darker design than its predecessor. Notably, the nose of the car, we're looking at a more black carbon kind of a design over last year's white. And also some slightly different sponsors such design placements. It looks a lot sleeker in general, in my opinion. I do prefer how the VF24 looks over the VF23, which is kind of weird because I actually had the VF23 as one of my favourite liveries last year, and now this year the VF24 isn't one of my favourite liveries, or it's not in my top three, but I prefer it over last year. So that just kind of shows how much I really didn't like last year's liveries. But anyway, not relevant. I think having more exposed carbon fibre does work quite well for Haas. When you pair it with the kind of colours in its branding with the white and the red, I think that black just kind of fits in with that quite nicely. So I don't think that they will ever have an issue doing a darker design. I think some teams such as Alpine don't really benefit from that so much, and we'll get onto that in a minute when we talk about Alpine in a bit more detail. But yeah, I think design wise the car looks sleek, it looks nice, it looks clean. I really like it. I know some people don't. Again, I know there's been a lot of issues with people talking about carbon fibre and black designs and stuff like that people haven't really liked so much this year. Fair enough, that's all down to personal preference in my opinion, but I really like it. Now if we're talking about the car itself and some of the technical aspects of it, we can see just looking at the car, it was taken a lot of inspiration from other successful cars last season, or this season just gone. So the biggest one I think we have to look at is the side impact structure and the side pod specifically. A lot of the cars going into this season have taken inspiration from the RB19, and we'll get into that in more detail as we kind of go through. But we can see that Haas is definitely one of those teams. Their side pods are very similar to Red Bull's Challenger last year. They have that very deep undercut channel underneath the side pod, and that has many benefits. Obviously, the big one being better airflow down to the rear of the car, making it more aerodynamically sound in general, creating that division as well from any airflow going towards the bottom of the car and airflow going over the top of the car. Just in general, a really great way to increase and enhance that downforce on the track and help them gain that speed and control going through corners and stuff like that. There also appears to be a similar rear wing design to that of last year's McLaren with some chopped off end plates, which again will be really interesting to see on track and how that can help enhance Haas's performance in general. And then another interesting aspect that I wanted to talk about was the suspension. Now, obviously, as we know, Haas are a customer team for Ferrari, and we now know, having seen the SF24, that this is true. But if we kind of imagine this from a pre SF24 launch perspective, we could look to the Haas to kind of see any spoilers for what we might see in the Ferrari setup. And we have definitely seen that in suspension. As expected, I mean, I didn't expect this to change coming into this year, but we have got a push rod setup. This is where we have, we're talking about the front here, by the way, not the rear. I don't think I wrote any notes about the rear of the Haas, to be honest, but just talking about the front suspension in general, the pushrod setup is when we're going to have the pushrod setting higher on the chassis and lower on the wheel assembly. So kind of like a forward slash, I guess. Just if that's what you were looking for, I'll have a picture on screen on the YouTube side of things. But for the podcast people out there, you're just going to have to try and imagine it. And so the question here was, could we see a similar setup on the Ferrari, which we now know to be true. We now know we do have that same push rod front suspension. Again, I never really expected that to change, but it's just interesting because a couple of different cars this season have changed their suspension. So that was fun to, I guess, have a little guess at that point in time. Obviously, like I say, now we know in hindsight that was true. But yeah, now we did actually see a preview of this car back in Austin, but it wasn't to its fullest potential, as we kind of found out, hearing from some of the team. Looking to that performance back in Austin, we did see a pretty solid performance from Haas. Hulkenberg, I think, finished 11th overall. There was some nice potential in the car. I think it looked like a nice package for Haas. And obviously now they've developed this over the winter. I'm excited to see what can happen. It's a nice car. It looks nice. The design is pretty good, especially in comparison to the other midfield cars. It's a solid car. I like it. Now, if we move on to the Ferrari, the SF24, it only makes sense to talk about the Ferrari after the Haas. Oh my god, I love this car. Let's talk about aesthetics first. The red is so much more red, which I love, because I think a lot of people were actually quite worried. Obviously, quite a few cars would come out with more, again, of that carbon look, more of a black, darker look. And Ferrari, thankfully, didn't go down that route, and they stuck more red. They increased the yellow aspect of the car, the white aspects. I love the details as well on this car. When we look at the car numbers, the driver numbers on the car, like the little yellow outlines around the outside, I think it looks so nice. Visually, it's a stunning car. I really love it. I'm a little bit biased as a Ferrari fan, but putting that to one side, I think it looks really nice. I love this car. I think it looks stunning. Now, talking about the car itself, we'll start with the front wing, actually, because it's quite interesting. Now, the nose appears to be sitting lower down this year, and the wing appears to be designed in a way where the airflow is going to be better directed to the underfloor of the car. We also have the airflow being divided up at the front, where we can see that cut between the nose and the bottom flap of that front wing. That's going to divvy up the air a lot more effectively, and the ability to get more air to that underfloor and pushing that out to the rear is going to be really important for Ferrari this year, because rear wing stability and rear grip in general is something that they really struggled with last season. We can also see, as I said, as expected, looking at the Haas, they have stuck with that push rod front, pull rod rear. No surprises there. I'm not going to spend too much talking about that, because we kind of knew that was going to happen. I think stick to what you know, it makes sense. Some people might have expected a switch around this year, and to be honest, I understand that. They might have expected more of a McLaren Red Bull style pull rod front, especially with them being Ferrari's closest competitors this year, obviously alongside Mercedes as well. I would understand if they were to go down that route, but that said, I think if Ferrari are able to find more balance, especially in the rear of the car, this shouldn't be too much of an issue going forward. I don't think it's going to affect them too much, again, as long as they can find that balance in other areas. So fingers crossed they've got that. Also looking at suspension, we can see some adjustments to the wishbone. It's sitting a little bit differently, which is going to help with anti-dive. Most of the cars, I'm pretty sure all of the cars have made adjustments to that wishbone to help with the anti-dive effect and stuff like that. So I'm not going to talk again too much about that, but it's just something to note in general. Now, my main talking point here, and again, what I said with the Haas and what's going to be my main talking point for most of these cars, is looking at side impact structure, specifically the side pod design, because the majority of the cars, as mentioned, have opted for that deep undercut design, similar to what we saw on the RB19. We know it's worked so well for Red Bull. And they've kind of flipped on that part, which is really interesting. And again, we'll talk about that when we move on to the Red Bull. But yeah, I mean, it's understandable that so many cars have gone down that route this season. Now, we can see that Ferrari have obviously opted for a much more tapered, deep cut side pod this year in comparison to the SF23, where the side pods, again, were a lot, they weren't bad per se, but in comparison to what the Red Bull and then what eventually the McLaren did come out with, it was not optimal in any way, shape, or form. Now, you might hear the word downwash used when describing the style of side pod. All that basically refers to is the downward ramping of the side pod. Now, again, on YouTube, I'm hopefully going to be able to show you the picture where I can kind of describe that. But for the podcast people, basically imagine that side pod ramping downwards, and that's referring to the airflow being pushed down towards the rear of the car overall as they're cutting through. For the Ferrari, everything is pointing towards a more stable car after all, overall. And a car that just in general appears to distribute the air around the car quite well. Again, of course, we're not going to really know until we see it out on track. I'm excited for the Ferrari. I think it looks great and the design looks good. In general, I think they've listened to what the issues were with the drivers last year and hopefully going to implement that going forward. So I am really excited. Moving on to the AM24, looking at the Aston Martin this year. Visually, there are little to no differences in terms of the design. The colours appear to be the same with some slight variation in sponsor placement. Nothing really worth mentioning in terms of design. The main talking points of the AM24 are definitely found within the technical aspects of the car. So if we start with the front wing on the AM24, in comparison to the AM23, the nose does appear to be a lot flatter, with the front wing in general sitting lower down. We kind of saw that with the Ferrari, and we can also see again that division between the nose and the front wing, which is going to help to direct that oncoming airflow into the underfloor of the car. Now, in terms of suspension, again, we're looking into things like anti-dive improvement, of that wishbone positioning. They've also gone for a push rod front, much akin to the Ferrari. Now, I actually found that quite interesting because Aston Martin do have the scope to mess around with things like suspension, potentially more than Ferrari. I don't know. I feel like Ferrari have kind of settled into their kind of suspension. I feel like Aston Martin can kind of mess around. I think they have a little bit less to lose than Ferrari. I don't know. But yeah, only time's going to tell. It's going to bode better in terms of push rod, pull rod front, both push and pull rear, push rear, like whatever the sort of combination that you're going for. So there's a lot of different combinations kind of going around, and it will just be a matter of time to tell what works best. Now, in terms of side pods, we are looking again to another RB19-esque design. The change obviously isn't as dramatic as what we've seen from the Ferrari's car last year to now, because the AM23 design wasn't too far off the mark when it came in comparison to the RB19. They had a really great start to the season last year. The undercut is a little bit more dramatic and deeper than last year's, to be honest. It's quite difficult to see in the pictures that I'm kind of looking at the minute because the lighting isn't great. But again, when it comes out on track, we'll be able to have a much better look at that and seeing and testing what we can kind of go with from there. The engine cover also looks to be a point of interest on this car. The way that the air is going to be able to get directed down to the back of the car and towards the rear is really going to help with downforce as well. Because I did have some rear downforce and just rear wing stability issues in general at points. So I think that's really going to help the Aston Martin out this year. Now, a really interesting point about this car is that Alonso said that the car is different in areas that you can't see. So I'm really interested to see how the external is going to work with the internal, what they've changed in terms of, there's not going to be too much change, I don't believe, in terms of engine. But things like brakes, cooling system, stuff like that, I'm excited to see how the car operates and how it's able to sustain itself as well. Like, will it be a long-term kind of vibe? So yeah, I'm excited for that as well. Moving on to the W15, the new Mercedes car. This car is definitely one for some talking points. Now, talking aesthetically, I absolutely love the design. I think it's sleek. I think it's nice. Again, Mercedes, like Haas, are one of the few teams that I think suit a darker design, and I think it really fits their branding. I would have really loved to have seen a silver livery this year, but I'm happy with what we've got. I think that darker designs in general really do suit Mercedes, so I am happy with what we've got. Now, in terms of the technical changes to the car, Mercedes have made multiple changes from the W14 to W15, starting with that largely debated front wing. Now, to touch on the legality of the situation, because I know that's up for debate at the minute, I watched a really great video on YouTube by Kyle.engineers. He's on YouTube. Go and watch his videos, and specifically his video on the W15. If you haven't already, he's an ex-aerodynamicist. He's actually worked at Mercedes as well in the past, and he went into a lot more detail about the legality perspective. It's really interesting. But from his perspective, the front wing is legal. I'm choosing to trust his word because he knows a lot more than I do. But yeah, if you are interested in a different perspective on that, definitely go and check out that video. I'll link it in the description of the podcast and the description of the YouTube video. So if you are interested, go have a look. But talking about the design itself, first of all, again, we see that divide, what we've seen in a couple of other cars this year to help to separate that airflow. We've also got a really interesting in-wash section right at the middle of that front wing. I think that's likely in place, obviously, to direct the air more towards the middle of the car and down through the middle of the underfloor to really project that airflow powerfully down to the rear and maximise the downforce as much as they can from it. We've also got a scoop at the front of the front wing, which is an interesting design alongside the sort of wavy design of the rearmost flap. Also is going to help to balance out the high and low air pressure quite nicely. So a lot of interesting complex design choices within that front wing, which is going to help them sort of hopefully cut through the air like butter and divvy up that air quite nicely when it comes to the flow of the car. Now, additionally, we can see some anti-dive adjustments. Again, as usual, we've got a push rod front suspension and a completely new side pod design, which was obviously coming after the absolute disaster execution of their zero side pod design that they went with last year. Now, on a basic level, it does look very similar to what the Ferrari's got. This makes sense. They're both going to be in basic foundational stages of this new side impact structure system, and they're going to have to develop it accordingly based on what their drivers are saying and based on how they're performing. That said, time will tell with that one, but I was kind of expecting them to look pretty similar in terms of the side pod design. Mercedes appear to have opted for a P-shaped inlet, and that stretches forward at the front, which again is much akin to the Red Bull. Again, I think we're going to see this in a lot of cars, and we have seen this in a lot of cars, the way that inlet does stretch forward right across the side of the car, and it's helping to kind of divide those two areas of the car up quite nicely. You can also see a new engine cover design. The radiator inlets are in a better place, which is going to help with their cooling, which is really important for the Mercedes. Other things to note, We also see the cockpit pushed back around about 10 centimetres, which will be nice for Lewis. This is something that he was complaining about a little bit last year. It's not quite as far back as what we see on the Red Bull, but it's still better for registering things like sensitivity and stuff like that. So a lot of changes have been made with the W15 this year. I really hope it's more competitive. Obviously, with this being Lewis's last season in the Mercedes as well, so it's going to be quite important they can at least compete for wins, if not necessarily a championship, but at least compete for wins in a lot of the different races. So fingers crossed for them, but again, only time will tell. Now moving on to the Williams, the FW46 is what we're looking at, and this car is super interesting in general. It is the first car that's been developed under James Vowles. I love James Vowles. He's great. Anyway, moving on from that, starting off visually, I love that they've kept that Duracell inclusion on the car. I think it's so smart. I think it's such good branding. I love the way it looks. That said, I don't like how dull the Williams is. I don't like, there's not much brightness in colour. I know there's not much they can do. It's just personal preference. That said, I understand it paying homage to sort of like those older car designs. I get it. I like it. It feels nostalgic. It's just for me, personal preference wise, I do prefer a brighter looking car. That's just completely personal though. I completely understand why people do like the car. So, but talking about the more technical designs, now last year William singular. Williams had a lot of straight line speeds, but it did compromise heavily on downforce. Now we haven't actually seen the car itself launched, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not sure that the livery that we've seen is on the new car. I think that's not actually been released yet. I don't think we'll see it till testing. I could be wrong. I could have completely missed it. So please let me know if I am wrong. But in terms of predictions of what we're going to see, I think that we're going to be seeing a lot of the same sort of stuff that we've spoken about, maybe more division on that front wing to direct some of that effort to the underfloor to increase that downforce, more extreme sort of undercut channels on the side pods, just stuff like that, things that are going to really help and enhance that aero performance and help to increase the speed around corners, because that is something that Williams did struggle with last year. Again, I could be wrong, I could have completely missed this, but I don't think that I've seen the Williams new car yet, so I can't comment too much on it because I can't comment on a car that I've not seen. I don't know. So we'll move on. We're going to move on to the steak. Is that what we're going with? Yeah, Sauber steak. The C44 basically. I'm going to keep with steak. I think that's what we're going to go with. Now, please do bear in mind that when I make comparisons to this car, I am comparing it to the Alfa Romeo of last year. If you are confused, if you are new to F1, that's what steak is, what Alfa Romeo was. So just keep that in mind. Now, of course, a huge talking point for steak this year is delivery, and I'm going to be totally honest. I love it. I think it's stunning. I think it's really Ben 10. I think it's bright. I think it's shocking. I think at night time it's going to be absolutely stunning. I can't wait to see it. I get why people don't like it. It's a bit kitsch. It's a little bit, electric. But I think it's really nice. I love it. I'm sorry. Hands up. I love it. I think it's a great car. I think it's a nice change in colours from what we're used to seeing on the grid. What we're used to seeing is such like rich classic colours. I think this shocking green is just like, I love it. I think it's great. But moving on to the important part of the car, looking at it from a more technical perspective, as we have so far, we will start on the front wing. There doesn't appear to be too much of a difference on the front wing and the rear wing, actually, of the Alfa Romeo last year. They seem to be sticking with that nice chunky front wing design, and the rear wing, I believe, is the same. So I think that the main differences for the steak this year are in the suspension and in the side impact structure. Again, we see another team implementing those RB19 style side pods, that deep undercut system. The cooling inlets appear to be a little bit wider, just based on first look, which is going to be really important in terms of cooling down those internal components. And then the lip of that inlet does go quite far down the chassis, which again mentioned when talking about the Mercedes. I don't know, I've spoken about so many cars so far. But I said that we would see on quite a few different cars, again taking inspiration from that of the Red Bull. Now, all in all, this design, I think, is going to really, really help with diverting that air to the rear, working towards a rear grip. I think a lot of cars have been doing improvements on that. Again, we're looking at the upper part of that side pod, looking at the downwashing. I just think in general, the car looks strong in terms of stability. I don't know how quick it's going to be. We will see when it comes to testing. I think Alfa Romeo, one of those cars that are quite hit or miss most weekends. So it's just going to be a matter of seeing it out on track. In terms of suspension, we're looking at a pull rod front. That, again, is very close to the RB19. I actually think this car in general is very, very close to the RB19. I think it's quite a mishmash between the RB19 and then the MCL60, which makes sense because they're both very, very strong cars last year. So I'm really excited to see this car on track. Do I think it's going to be a little bit behind other cars if they are taking inspiration from two cars that worked well last year? Yes. But do I think it's going to be strong in general? Also, yes. I think if they're taking the best parts of those cars, you can't go too far wrong. It's just going to be based on how strong the development is from everyone else. So I hope to see at least a more consistent car this year from Stake, because that is something they did struggle with last year. But, you know, at least from an aero perspective, more consistent. We will just have to see. It's just one of those cars. I'm just excited to see the car specifically on track because I love it. I think it's gorgeous. Now, moving on to Alpine. Aesthetically, I don't like it. I'll be honest. Some people do, some people hate it. I definitely don't hate it. I just, yeah. I mean, I understand why they've gone for a more carbon-heavy design. I get it, and I understand what the benefits of those are. But Alpine are one of the few teams on the grid that have the luxury of being a little bit more outrageous in their designs. They have the luxury of having a little bit more fun with it. Especially they were teasing that like whole pink camo thing on their Instagram. I was kind of like, wow, this is going to be sick. I can't wait to see this car. And then it was just so dull and dreary, and I just don't like it. And it is just personal preference at the end of the day. Like, and I do think it does look nice. I think it looks clean. I just wish they'd gone for something a little bit more adventurous. But yeah, anyway, we'll move on to technical. Now, I actually made this comment at the start of last season. Maybe it was poorly timed then, but I will make it again. I do think that Alpine could be dark horses in the midfield this season, especially based on what we've seen of this car so far. Now, starting on that front wing, the nose is pretty flat actually, and I'm assuming that's going to be in them aiding trying to get more air over the top of the car and towards the rear wing. So that'll be quite interesting to see that on track, especially in comparison to quite a few other cars looking to direct more airflow into the underfloor. So seeing that in comparison will be quite nice, and seeing their sort of stability in general will be interesting. The Alpine have got a push rod front suspension and rear suspension, but the big talking point, as has been with every single car that we've spoken about so far, is that really aggressive undercut looking at those side pods. Now, Alpine in particular have quite an aggressive undercut situation going on. Very tapered, and the top of that side pod is also tapered for that water slide kind of effect. Now, I do believe that Alpine have had to be more aggressive in their approach to their aero designs this year, especially because they do tend to deficit in terms of engine, with their engine being a little bit less than a lot of the other cars that we have on the grid. So shifting their focus to aero, and also reductions in the weight of the car, which I believe I've read that the weight has been reduced, should hopefully help them to make up a little bit of time. I don't think it's going to be that much time, but when you're looking at a midfield battle, especially with how close it was last year, every little helps. We've had a couple of changes to the placement of things in the rear, which should help with things like ride height issues and stuff like that. All in all, I think that Alpine have gone aggressive with the things that they have been able to change, I think, in order to prepare themselves for the fact that their car might not be as fast from an engine perspective as everyone else is. So I'm excited to see how these things work, especially in tracks where speed isn't everything, where you need to focus on more of those aero aspects. So yeah, I don't know. Watch out for Alpine this year. Anyway, we'll move on to the McLaren now, talking about the MCL38. McLaren obviously are going to be a team that we're going to have to keep a close eye on. Considering how they shot up last season in testing, they're definitely going to be a team that I'll be focusing on. It'll be interesting to see how they'll do in reference to everyone else, because everyone has appeared to be making the changes that they made last year. So how are they going to develop on that? And how are they going to enhance the things that they did last year? Visually, I think it's a little dark. I really enjoyed the pops of colour that we had last year and the livery. At this point, I've made it no secret that I do prefer the colourful liveries, but I do feel like McLaren maybe could have done a little bit more of it. Again, it's personal preference, so it is what it is. And I do understand why teams have opted for a more carbon-heavy look. It's just not a preference of mine, which is fair. Now, talking about the car itself is actually pretty interesting from a tech perspective. So starting on that front wing, we can see again the detachment of the nose from that front part of the front wing, which again, as we mentioned earlier, is going to help to split that airflow and redirect it towards the floor of the car and help with downforce overall. Now, in terms of suspension, they've gone with pull rod, same as last year, same as Red Bull, to be expected. Didn't expect any changes there. The side pods have been enhanced. McLaren have taken a step towards the RB19 style side pods already. They did that last year, I believe, in Austria, was it? Don't quote me on that, but yeah, we know that worked really, really well for them. So no surprise that they've sort of gone further into that. it is interesting to see how they've developed that further, how they've made that undercut deeper and enhanced their air inlets as well to get the air to flow better across the top of that side impact structure and towards the rear, and in turn making the car a lot less draggy and more aerodynamically sound. So I'm excited to see how that's going to improve them, especially things like speed in straights and going around corners, because they're going to have to be top in everything they do. It was a very quick car last year. I just think they needed an extra push, and hopefully these changes will give them that extra push. But yeah, ensuring the airflow around the tops and the sides of the car and making sure that works in conjunction with the airflow underneath the car is going to be really important for McLaren this year. It's going to be one of their top priorities. On paper, it seems like McLaren have got this figured out. They've got a couple of other little bits and bobs, like movement of some of the layout of some of the components, including things like the radiator, and some of the cooling components. I think in general, when you put it all together, it looks like a strong car. I'm excited to see McLaren on track in testing. So yeah, all in all, fingers crossed for it. But again, it's going to be one of those cars that we'll just have to look at in comparison to everyone else and kind of make our judgments as and when. But on paper, it looks like a strong car. Now, moving on to our final two cars on the grid, the two Red Bull, in the Red Bull family. So we'll start with the Racing Bulls, the VCarb 01. Oh my god, I'm obsessed. Visually, I think this is the most stunning car I've seen this season. It's my favourite livery of the season so far. I love it. I love the references back to Toro Rosso. I love the vibrancy. It's classic. I can't wait to see it at night. I can't wait to see it in the day. I can't wait to see it go quick. I can't wait to see it break. It's stunning. I love it. You know, I've made it no secret. Again, I've said I love the more colourful cars on the grid, and this is so rich and vibrant. I just wish that every car has gone with this level. Oh, it's stunning. I love it. We also seem to have a lower down front wing, which is quite interesting. We've seen that with a couple of different cars. The suspension seems to be sitting a lot lower, so that should be interesting to see. As expected, they are using a pull rod front suspension, same as the Red Bull. Again, that was no surprise there. All in all, the design of the car actually does look pretty simple. Now, I don't know if there's going to be more adaptations by the time we get to testing. I don't know if there are things they're hiding. I think there probably are a couple of things that they're hiding. But generally speaking, I mean, you know, looking at that side impact structure, we can see pretty large quintessential Red Bull style inlets, deep undercuts by the side pods. I just feel like it's everything that we were expecting based on the RB19, and that's been brought into the VCarb this year. That said, there are a lot of little small changes, such as changes to parts of the halo. The car looks skinnier overall. The engine cover itself looks skinnier too, which can be as a result of some repositioning or redesigning of some of those internal components. So that'll be interesting to see when it comes to the actual running of the car and seeing how, I guess, reliable and sustainable it is. But in terms of things that I do want to draw attention to, I want to have a little talk about the end plates on the rear wing. Now, this is often used to cut out drag. We saw this successfully implemented by the McLaren last year, and we've seen it successfully implemented by Mercedes in the past. I believe, as I mentioned, Haas kind of have a similar kind of vibe going on this year. But yeah, that's going to be really interesting to see when we look at things like straight line speed. But in general, yeah, it's nice, it's simple, it's not got too much going on. Again, as I said, I think that's either saying to me that there are things that are being hidden by Racing Bulls that we're going to see in testing, or more simply, there are some aspects of the design, or the more important aspects of the design are the internal components, which I think is probably more likely. I think they probably made some decent changes to the internals of the car, and we'll see how that works in conjunction with the external parts of the car. So yeah, I'm happy with the VCarb. I think it's stunning. I said in terms of the look, I love it. I think it's the nicest looking car on the grid. But I'm excited to see how the technical aspects work as well. But yeah, now finally talking about the RB20. This is the car that I'm sure we've all been most excited to talk about, and probably were the most excited to see. And my lord, did it give people whiplash. It gave me a little bit of whiplash as well, because I looked at that car and I thought, that's not what I was expecting. So we'll start with the visuals of the car. I don't see too much of a design difference from last year. If it's not broken, don't fix it. I get it. I like the Red Bull livery design in general. Majority of the time, I think it's fine. There's nothing sizable for me to mention in terms of the design of the car. But Red Bull have been very secretive with this car. At the launch, things were being hidden. There was a group of, I don't know if they were engineers or what, standing by the rear of the car. There was a lot being hidden there. The renders definitely aren't telling the full picture as well. There's a lot being hidden, but there are definitely a couple of big talking points based on what we can see. Now, first of all, looking at the front wing, they've gone in a slightly different direction with the front wing. And that nose is fully connected onto those flaps. We're really working on getting that airflow over the top of the car this year, which is really interesting. It's nice and chunky. I'm really excited to see the full shots when we see the car out on track, so I can really have like a deep dive to see what's going on. But all in all, it's looking strong. The engine cover as well appears to be similar to the Mercedes, which was an interesting feature. I wasn't really expecting that. But again, in terms of suspension, we're sticking to that pull rod suspension. Now I've got all the boring stuff out of the way. I know you guys don't want to talk about that. I know you guys want to talk about the side pods. I know you guys want to talk about the side impact structure and the side pods, because what the hell is going on? They seem to have been able to pull everyone down this rabbit hole of the RB19, going for those the really deep undercut structure, saying, yeah, this is a successful one. Every single car on the grid has done that this season, and they've gone, oh, sorry. And they've just gone for the most dramatic switch. I say the most dramatic switch. We'll break it down. Talking about the side pods themselves, I don't think there's too much of a plot twist. The big plot twist is the inlet, and we'll get onto that in a minute. But talking about the side pod structure, we do still have a strong undercut channel here. That's not necessarily gone, but we also have a very strong overbite area, which I believe actually was started by Alpine originally in the past. As I've sort of mentioned before, the air is going to slip really nicely on the body of the car here. They're really, really working clearly on cutting through that air and being as aerodynamic as possible. But of course, the big talking point here is the air inlets. Now, to begin with, people were saying, where are they? I can't see them. I don't think they exist. And then upon closer inspection, they appear to be vertical. Now, I think it's very possible that what we're looking at aren't the inlets per se, and more so air ducts with the actual inlet design sitting inside the car and not visible to the outside or visible externally. I wouldn't be surprised if Red Bull have gone for that, but either way, they are different, they are hidden, and in general, this side impact design is going to allow the Red Bull to cut through the air so nicely and so easily. It's going to slip to the rear really, really, really well. If we know anything about Red Bull, we know that the floor is going to be incredibly strong. Aerodynamically, expect this car to be great. Like, looking at this design, you know it's going to be good. If there's one thing that Adrian Newey can do, is they can look at the downfalls of other cars and be like, I can fix that, and then do it. Not that I'm saying that this is the same design as the Mercedes last year. It's not. A lot of people have said that this is the same as a zero impact, zero side pod design. It's not. We have still got strong side pods in place. We've still got an undercut channel going on. We have a stronger overbite, and we do have vertical air inlets, and they are the big changes that we can see this year. There are people out there who go into a lot more detail about the aerodynamics of this a lot better than I ever could. So if you are more interested in seeing a bit more about how that can impact the car, definitely go watch their videos, listen to their podcast, blah, blah, blah. But it's something to note if you weren't aware of it already. All we know is that Red Bull love a challenge, and they love to try and make their life a little bit harder. And that's what they've gone with. And Adrian Newey, as we know, is a mastermind, so I wouldn't be surprised if he's created something completely different. It's going to be absolutely amazing and sweep the entire competition off the grid. That's just the way he likes to roll. So yeah, that is they are our 10 cars. They are our 10 cars this year. That is in a bit more detail, looking at the livery and at the more technical aspects of the design. As I said earlier, I'm no expert. I'm just going for the things that I know. There are people out there who have a lot more technical knowledge than I do. If you are more interested in a bit more of a technical deep dive, definitely go have a look at their channels and look at their stuff. But yeah, in general, I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope that it gave you a little bit more information based on what we can expect from these cars going forward. And yeah, that's it from me so far. I'll be back with another video after testing so we can break that down and talk about some of the performances from those cars and match them up with some of the predictions that we've made, not predictions, but some of the comments that we've made from today's video slash podcast, because it's going to be both. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed. Have a great weekend. I will see you after testing.